Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today what I thought we'd do is update our tier list since we have had a new product. It's been a couple of weeks, so we have had the meta sort of stabilize a little bit. We have a good idea of what the good and the bad decks are. So what we're looking at here is basically our last tier list. This was after just a few weeks of the Requiem of Collapse format, and this happened just before the GRF. Now, during that GRF, obviously, we had the ridiculous amount of representation of Psychic Fusion in the top 100, and after that, we started seeing it winning almost every single event. But before that, we did see the Dark Galaxy and the Mataran deck really outperforming the Psychic Fusion. So that was what this list was kind of based on. Since then, obviously, the meta has developed quite a lot. We did have the GRF, we have had a new product release in the Boost Red Boot deck build box. So we have had a new injection of cards, some old decks got stronger, and we have had a few new decks arise. So first things first, let's take a look at the tournament results. So we have been seeing a noticeable number of Psychic tournament wins and Psychic tournament tops. Psychic have 4 tournament wins of the 7 that have happened during this format, which is pretty good. That's obviously over a 50% win rate. We've seen them top 4 9 times, we've seen them get 19 top 8, and they are currently tied with Dragon Fusion for the most points in the top 4. So just putting this together, it's obviously a very well-liked deck, it's doing very well, it's won the most tournaments, it is without a doubt the best deck in the game right now, so that 100% goes in first place. This deck is still really strong. It is still the strongest deck in the game. The deck is a little bit complicated to play, but the deck's ceiling is absolutely obscene. Being able to get out the Candy Live Boss monster, reduce your opponent's monster's attack down to 0 at the cost of 2000 life, or bring back a level 7 body from the graveyard, which could be either Prima Gitana or the Can Melody. We can also increase our life points by a really ridiculous amount. The Candy Live itself can boost us by 1000 each and every turn. We have the Psypic Upper, which again can boost our life points by 800. There's just a lot going on in this deck. We have easy access to the Candy because we can use the skill to send it to the graveyard. Then we can use our Jamp spell cards to once again gain more life points and have easy access to boss. The deck just seems to do a little bit of everything. It can OTK, it can swarm the board, it can boost your own life points. The only real negative the deck has is that we do have to find 2 of the 3 pieces to get the combos going. Realistically, if we only have 1 of the 3 pieces of our combo, so for example, let's say we have Fusion, we can't use the skill to get both the Psypic Upper and the Candy to go into our Fusion. So if we do only find 33% of our combo, that does kind of let the deck down, but when that doesn't happen, basically you're popping off every turn, boosting your life points, swarming the board, and potentially threatening an OTK. So the next deck we'll take a look at is Dragon Fusion, and once again, very popular deck. The actual strange thing is this deck keeps topping, it keeps doing really well, but it's not actually converting those into tournament wins. It's only had 1 tournament win, and that was in the Quantum Rush 49, which was the first tournament that this deck was legal. So it's won the first tournament where you could maybe say it won because it had a surprise factor. People hadn't maybe played against the deck, they didn't know how to play against the deck, they didn't know how strong the deck would be, but it hasn't really managed to convert into tournament wins beyond that. Again, we've had lots of top 4 finishes, but no actual tournament wins. And if we go down here, we can see, points-wise, again, the meta is basically made up of Psychic Fusion and Dragon Fusion. That's 75% of top 4 points are just on those 2 decks alone. I think realistically, it does make sense to have this bumped up to tier 1. Now, prior to this list, we did not have Mirror Gear Star F, which is a very powerful boss monster. Having a 3000 attack point monster that can attack directly is really strong. On top of the fact we can use its effect to reduce all of our opponent's board by 1500 each and then get double attack. One of the big strong OTK combos we have seen come out of this is that you summon out your Mirror Gears, use its effect to reduce 2 of your opponent's level 7 and lower monsters. Obviously this doesn't work if your opponent doesn't have 2 level 7 or lower monsters, but then we fuse it off into our Mirror Gear Star F, which again is quite easy to do because our skill does work with Mirror Gears as well as Dragius, so really good there. Then we can use its effect to reduce them by a further 1500, meaning we have reduced our opponent's board by 3000 attack, and we get to double attack, which is absolutely insane. This deck is also quite easy to play, and it's actually quite easy to build. Now, there are some builds going around which do have like selection box cards, but realistically we don't need those. The only card that's actually sort of difficult to get this deck needs is going to be that Dragius Star F itself. Other than that, everything is kind of in the deck build, or it's quite easy to come across, so the deck is also quite free to play friendly, which does make it a very attractive option. Realistically, this deck can just play defensively until you do draw into your combo pieces, until your opponent leaves monsters in attack, which lets you activate your skill to get your combo pieces. Then we just do our combo, and ideally we'll just OTK our opponent out of the game. And I think that is one thing both of these decks do have in common, that being the Dragon Fusion and the Psychic Fusion, is they are both very, very good at OTKing your opponent. So next up we have Cyber Dragon, and no tournament wins, but this deck has been quite consistently topping ever since it came out with the release of Go Rush, or I suppose it came out a little bit before in its structure deck, but it really hit its stride when Go Rush came out and we got access to the Cyber Twin Dragon. So this deck has been really, really good, but again hasn't quite been able to convert. Now naturally, this deck is nowhere near the other two decks above it. It is a drastic drop off from 29 points down to 7 points, and if we take a look at our pie chart, is this little yellow slivers down here, which is noticeably a lot smaller than Psychic and Dragon Fusion's pieces of the pie. So I think it's safe to say this definitely does drop down a tier, and I think just because none of the other decks are currently on this list, we're also going to bump these two down as well. So Cyber Dragon still is a very consistent deck. This deck can get out boss monsters for very little investment. The monsters it does summon actually have pretty good stats, so you're not easily just broken apart, which is why this deck had quite a good matchup into both of the Galaxy, that being Light and Dark. This deck is still relatively simple to play, it's relatively free to play friendly, it's still a strong deck even though it hasn't really had any new support in a while, so realistically, it is still nowhere near the other two decks above it. They are just outperforming it, they are outshining it in almost every way, but the Cyber Dragon deck has been holding its own, it has been doing quite well in events, and I wouldn't be surprised if this deck continued to keep topping. Next up we have Mataran, and Mataran has had a tournament win, and has seen a few tops, but has been underperforming at least compared to last format. In the last format, Mataran was the second most popular deck, it was the second most powerful deck, and prior to Psychic rising to power, it was the best deck in the game. So we were expecting Mataran to be performing a little bit better than it has been, but the deck is still in an okay spot. I think realistically, this is going to be another tier 2 deck. This deck still can win games in a very convincing fashion. We still are able to have a sort of toolboxed extra deck. We're able to go into all these different monsters. A Sure Start is still absolutely fantastic, being able to destroy face down cards, or using the type Change Beam to just OTK your opponent, and that will never stop being good realistically. The downside this deck has is that it can be a little bit slow. It can be a little bit inconsistent because again, we don't have a way to convincingly find that fusion. So if we don't find it early, we can be in a bit of a bad spot. The other negative this deck really has is that because it can be a bit slow, decks that are exceedingly fast can counteract it, and we have seen that with Dark and Light Galaxy. But as we have started to see Light and Dark Galaxy kind of fall by the wayside a bit, maybe there is a world in which Mataran can start to shine again. Now, the counterpoint to that is it still has an okay match into Psychic, but it doesn't have a particularly great match into the Dragon Fusion deck, which can again play this very aggressive style, can get a lot of damage in very quickly, and potentially could get a ton of damage and even OTK you with the Dragius Star F. So next up we have Machine Good Stuff, which again has actually got a tournament win under its belt. Again, we're not seeing a ton of representation from this deck, but when we are seeing it, it is actually doing quite well. Not too many points to really speak of, but that's because again, it's not been super popular. But this deck is actually pretty strong. I think it is, though, again, noticeably weaker than the Cyber Dragon and the Ashura Star decks. So I think, again, we're going to have to bump everything else in this tier down again. So Machine Good Stuff is an interesting list because it basically is Mirror Innovator and Friends. The deck has received a bit of a buff in that Jointech Leo has been unlimited, which means we can use it to recycle our Ancient Gear Golem and our Jointech Rex, which are actually pretty good boss monsters. Jointech Rex especially can shuffle cards from your graveyard back into your deck to just keep reusing them, and that is kind of the theme of the deck, is we keep shuffling cards from our graveyard back into our deck to reuse them later. We have Mirror Innovator, we have Surge Bicorn, we have Jointech Rex, we have all these cards that can just keep allowing us to reuse and reuse and reuse, just keep recycling everything from our graveyard, which is really strong. But the main reason this deck really stands out is because it has 4 boss monsters that have piercing between Ancient Gear Golem and the 3 copies of Mirror Innovator. What that means is we don't have to summon everything in attack mode, which is actually very key to this meta. If we take a look at Psychic, Psychic is able to use Candy Live to reduce the attack of all your opponent's monsters by 3000. If your opponent only has 1 monster on their field, that means you're not going to get punished quite as hard. We've already spoken a little bit about the Mirror Gear Star and how that combo works, and again, if your opponent has less monsters face up in attack position, it cannot punish you as hard. And again, Type Change Beam Assura Star combo doesn't punish you as hard if we only have the one monster. So Machine Good Stuff is able to play on sort of a different axis to these other decks, where we can set 2 monsters and just have one big piercer in attack mode, keep recycling our piercers to keep having access to them, and try and play the game that way. Now, we won't always be able to win this way, but this is another preventative measure that we can take to try and have a better matchup against the higher tier decks. And the next deck we're going to talk about is a brand new deck, that being the Red Boot deck, or High Tech Dragons, depending on how we want to call it. So this deck is brand new and has been a little bit overshadowed by Dragon Fusion, but is still a respectable deck. Realistically, I think this deck deserves to be in tier 3. It is undeniably weaker than all the decks above it, but the skill that it has, RB Drive, is actually quite powerful. We're able to use this to have easy access to a boss monster. We can put specific cards we want in the graveyard into the graveyard, or we could use it to fix our hand in being able to search our deck for either a flip or flap dragon to discard cards if we have too many, or we could even grab Star Replacer to count as 2 extra bodies to get out an extra tribute monster. So I think a lot of people did underestimate this deck. We looked at the skill, we looked at the card, and we went, this doesn't look that great. I personally always thought the skill looked like it had a lot of potential, but the Red Boot Dragon itself was always the problem. It's a rather unremarkable boss. But the skill is powerful enough and does give you enough options to actually really toolbox the light dragons in your deck, that I think this deck can actually fight with the big boys. Now, is it going to consistently be able to defeat the decks above it? Realistically not. But it is a lot stronger than people did give it credit for, and it's not actually positioned in such a bad spot this meta, especially compared to some of the other decks. And then we have Dark Galaxy. So Dark Galaxy has very much fallen from grace. During the Requiem of Collapse meta, this was arguably the 3rd best deck. It was performing very, very well. It was very, very simple to play. It had a very, very aggressive game plan. We were able to summon out a lot of monsters very easily and have access to a lot of piercing. Unfortunately, that strategy seems to have deteriorated a bit in this meta. Psychic don't care about that as much. Realistically, Psychic can just outlive the aggression that Galaxy has, unless Galaxy basically gets like a custom hand and can like finish them off very quickly. Dragon Fusion can just play a lot of high defense monsters and kind of weather the storm when it comes to Dark Galaxy, just survive the onslaught from their attacks and then kill them on the crackback. And Cyber Dragon has always had a really strong matchup into the Dark Galaxy. So unfortunately, Dark Galaxy is not in a fantastic spot right now. So I'm actually going to bump this down to Rogue. And I know a lot of people are going to have a problem with this. A lot of people are going to say there's no way Dark Galaxy is Rogue. This is just my opinion, again backed up by the facts of tournament results. I do think you could make an argument for low tier 3, but realistically this is either top of Rogue or bottom of tier 3, and I'm quite content to have it in high Rogue for now. So again, this deck still is relatively powerful, and against some decks it can still be really strong, but the way that Dark Galaxy tends to win games is by punishing your opponent for having low defense monsters in defense position and trying to bully them out of the game very, very quickly. Unfortunately, we're not really in a meta right now where it's able to take advantage of that. I still think this deck will have some really good matchups, such as the Red Boot deck will still have a lot of low defense monsters. Mataran notoriously still has a lot of low defense monsters, so you will still be able to win a lot of games against those sort of decks, but against the rest of the field and the decks that are really taking up the top spots, unfortunately, it just doesn't have the power to take out those decks. Next up, we have Worm Fusion, which basically that and Light Galaxy are all in the same boat, right? All of these decks have only had one single top 8 in the last 2 weeks, so they have all fallen a bit from grace. Personally, I think Light Galaxy should remain in tier 3, but I do think that Worms should be bumped down to high Rogue. So why are we saying that we want Light Galaxy in tier 3? Well, Light Galaxy has been in a bit of a weird place where it hasn't really been that popular, but the deck has still been reasonably strong. The deck is still able to apply a ridiculous amount of pressure very, very quickly by using the skill to get the secret order. We can summon out our monsters quite easily because the skill basically pluses us. We can use it to search out the meteor charge to change monsters to attack, as well as give another one piercing, which is just a ton of ridiculously big damage. And we have Galactica Force, which can also boost all of our monsters' attack up. So we can still get a ridiculous amount of damage in and try to OTK our opponent, which can be really, really powerful. Now, the reason I'm giving this deck the benefit of the doubt is because it has done quite well in places like the GRF, and even in the last format, although it wasn't performing crazily well in terms of points, in terms of the representation to conversion rate, it actually did really well. I mean, if you look here, we had 0 wins for Worms, Dragons, Machines, Cyburst, and Insect, but even though representation meant Light Galaxy was so low on this list, it still had 2 tournament wins. So I think although this deck has fallen out of popularity, it's fallen out of favor, the deck is still very strong, and it has shown time and time again that it can be a top contender. But that being said, bottom of tier 3 I think is where we're going to leave it, because in the last 2 weeks, since the latest product has released, it has not been performing that well. And then when it comes to the Worms, realistically, the Worm deck is really cool. It's really fun. It does a similar thing to what the Cyber Dragon deck does, which is it's able to get 3 big bodies on the board. Unfortunately, we are currently in a meta where leaving a bunch of monsters face up on the field can be a little bit detrimental. And this deck can sometimes struggle to beat set 3 pass because we are going to need access to that field spell. We are going to have to need access to our fusion. If we do get all of that, we can pop stuff out of the way, we can start getting a lot of damage in. But if we can't, we can feel a little bit slow. But once again, leaving 3 monsters face up on the field in attack position, which is what this deck wants to do, does mean Psychic is going to reduce them all by 3,000 and kill you. Dragons are going to reduce them all by 1,500 or 3,000 and kill you. Mataran is going to use Type Change Beam, change them onto Warriors, summon out a Sure Star, absorb their attack, and just kill you. Unfortunately, it is not in a particularly favourable place right now, but again, there still will be some matchups where Worms are going to be really, really strong. For example, I still think Worms are pretty good into Dark Galaxy, into Light Galaxy. I think the deck is okay into something like Machine Good Stuff or Cyber Dragon. This deck is still has a place in the meta, but because it is only very specific matchups, I don't think we can put it any higher than High Rogue. So then we come to the rest of the decks, and none of the rest of these decks have basically been seeing any play in the last 2 weeks, some of them not even in the last 2 months. So we have not seen the Spellcaster Fusion deck performing at all. We have not seen this in the last 2 months so much as get a top 8, so this definitely is dropping down to Rogue. Realistically, it's a similar story for the Worm Maximum deck. The deck can still be okay, but it has not been performing as of late. Then we have the Hero deck. I think the Hero deck is actually okay. It's not in a fantastic spot, but it did see a couple of top 100 finishes in the GRF. The deck is in a bit of an awkward spot right now, but again, that's why it's in Rogue and not a tiered position. Then we have the Cyburst deck and Yggdrago. I think realistically, this is probably past its prime a little bit, but has had a little bit of life breathed into it because Light Galaxy again has fallen out of favor. The main reason Cyburst got kind of forced out of the meta was because it didn't really have any good answer for having your monsters change to defense position and then pierced over. The deck basically has to run entirely 0 and 100 defense monsters, when there is a deck that literally says, I'm going to swarm the board on like turn 2, turn 3, I'm going to try and change your guys to defense and pierce over them. Unfortunately, that is just not in matchups Cyburst can realistically win. Then we have the Fusionless Psychic. This deck was doing quite well, but again, hasn't really done anything and probably won't realistically because we have got the Psychic Fusion, so I'm quite content to take that out of the list entirely. Then there's Blaster's Inferno, which was actually doing quite well in the previous meta, but has since fallen off drastically, probably because, again, it doesn't have great matchups into a lot of the decks that are much higher up on the tier list. And then there is the Warrior Fusion deck, which again, hasn't done anything in a while and did just get nerfed with Star Restart going to limit 3 when the deck already plays Yamiterasu and Yami Ruler at limit 3, which was just an extra nerf this deck really did not need, and unfortunately that has meant it has dropped down as well. So the only other deck I really want to talk about is the Insect deck, and I still think the strongest version of Insects is going to be the Dai Gyakuteno build. Now, this might not end up being the strongest build, but this is the only build that has managed to top an event. We have not seen Insects realistically do anything more than that yet, so this Dai Gyakuteno is going to represent Dai Gyakuteno Insects, and I do think this deck does have some potential. It's not insane, it's not a tiered deck, but I think bottom of High Rogue is where I like it. Again, it has topped the tournament, and I think because of that, we have to give it respect where it is due. The deck can just get a little bit lucky, mill into some Insects after turning your opponents into Insects, and pop 2 of their guys, which is really strong. In that way, it's sort of like a Dynast Dorcas with a bit of RNG attached, but it can actually destroy monsters that are higher than level 8, which is really, really good. So this is the list. Realistically, I think this is an accurate depiction of the meta. I know some people would move just a few things around, like some people would have dragons at the top of tier 2 instead of in tier 1. Some people would probably have Dark Galaxy up in tier 3, but I think this is pretty good. I am quite happy with how this looks. So thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.